Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome to people joining this panel. We'll just give it a few minutes to let people come in, but it's lovely to see you for our fourth panel of the conference. Final day. I've got some great talks today. It looks like everybody's in. People may be joining us as we go. So I'm going to kick off and welcome you all to this panel on communities of care, trauma, in/exclusion, and non-violence. So thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, I do have to say that two of our scheduled speakers, Surya Nayak and JC Walker, have had to drop out due to unforeseen circumstances, which is such a shame. I'm delighted to say, though, that we have Michelle Vaughan with us, and our own Christian Klesse will be presenting as well. I love this topic. I think it's a great thing to kind of come to on the third day. If you look at the content of our previous three panels, they all tie in quite nicely to this in different ways. So I think it's quite good that this is coming on the third day. It should be a really interesting discussion between Christian and Michelle. I'd like to encourage the audience to use the Q&A function as we're going along. Please do put all your questions in there, and our speakers will give their presentations and then come to those questions at the end once they've finished presenting. I'm sure we'll have a very lively discussion, but it really helps to have your input. So please do make your contributions in the Q&A and give our speakers some questions to start their discussion off. I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Michelle. Michelle joins us from Ohio, I believe, where she's a licensed psychologist and researcher and associate professor in the School of Professional Psychology at Wright State University, along with many other strings to her bow, many of which she'll be talking about today, I'm sure. She's going to be talking about caring communities for marginalized populations within a polyamory organization. So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with all you all virtually today. Yes, I am in Dayton, Ohio, fairly early this morning. And I'm glad to be with you. So I do have some slides that we'll kind of walk through, and I'm super curious about what folks are interested in as we discuss and take questions this morning. Right. So I have a whole bunch of titles. There's a lot of them. A lot of them are consensual non-monogamy related. Mostly one of the things I'm going to draw on today with our conversation is I am the executive director of Poly Columbus, which is a social and educational nonprofit here in Central Ohio. I have been now for, I think this is my 7th year. And so that's what I'm going to really draw on extensively in terms of physical communities and organizational policy and practice that we follow. And a little side promotion for the upcoming anticipated summer 2022 Handbook of CNM Affirming Clinical Practice, which might feature a couple of your folks on the screen, just as an early promotion. I also work on the Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy for American Psychological Association's Division 44. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization, because certainly for an international audience, probably haven't heard of us. Why would you, right? So I'm not the founding executive director, but I'm the second executive director. Our organization was founded, I think about 12 or 13 years ago, and became a nonprofit just over, I think, 10 years ago, to provide a social and educational space for folks living and exploring ethical non-monogamy in Central Ohio. And there's been, when I got the invitation for this talk, I realized there was a number of really overlapping situations and challenges. And I've been very fortunate to be part of this organization, which I think is very unique, that has a very strong set of bylaws and processes, a wonderful group of people that have been with me on our board, and a wonderful group of people who kind of set up how we deal with, especially when there are concerns in the community, when there are safety issues. Certainly, we have a lot of folks who have histories with trauma, histories with maltreatment. And so I've been really happy with how that organization has been set up, the little tweaks we've made to our policy and procedures, and maybe some big discussion of kinds of situations we've been in to kind of protect those involved that have really come up with creating safe communities. So we have we have all of our documents are on open source and available to everyone, including our bylaws. So that's polycolumbus.org. And we really kind of walk through what we're about, who we're about, and then how we deal with things like complaints and concerns in the community, and what guidelines we use when there are concerns about behavior, and who we center in terms of safety and community. So we have kind of 7 core values here too, which are really draw on a lot of sources, but to me represent the best and the most promising of potential with ethical non-monogamy. So people's right to make sure, their own decisions and make their own choices in relationships and broader. So autonomy, the importance of communicating needs and preferences openly. Obviously, a really explicit form on consent, not to assume consent. So we will kind of model that throughout our processes and our meetings. Cooperation, we'll talk about maybe some instances where that came up with similar organizations when there was a person in the community we were concerned about their behavior and whether they were harmful. We do a lot of educational pieces, so that's why I love being part of the organization. I'm kind of the very nerdy people, but the resident academic nerd if somebody has a presentation topic. So how do we share information and correct things that may be myths within the community? How do we work towards inclusive practices as a nonprofit with a very limited budget? That has been something we have not always been perfect at, right? So we'll talk about some of those pieces. And of course, for a lot of folks, it's very important to kind of center that this is often a space that really overlaps with sex positive communities. We have a lot of kind of aligned and kind of parallel groups in the community that are kink positive, those kind of pieces as well. So I think a lot of places have a mission and a mission statement and a value statement. You see that. So that, I imagine, doesn't come as too much to a surprise. What I really like is we have I tried to boil it down, how we handle when there's a concern, what things can be shared with us as a concern, and a very transparent process, I think, is very important. We have an official conduct policy that is for all of our events, virtual and in person. Most of those were in person until COVID. Always freely available up on our website, copies available. So no one can come in and say, well, I just thought this was okay. I was like, here's the copy. You have the opportunity to ask. And we will hit major components of these in different events that are particularly relevant. So we have a all volunteer, all unpaid executive board, usually between 4 and 6 people. It is, if anything comes up that is a violation of the values or a specific complaint expressed to us relevant to those values, we have to share it with the full board, right? So we can't silo complaints. We can't hide, oh, somebody said something about a friend of mine. So there's process, I think, that's really important to back up policy. So that's really common. Of course, if they're reporting a concern about somebody we know, a partner, a metamor, second, third hand, we have to disclose our conflicts of interest. And if we have a close relationship or any relationship we might benefit from with the person who's they're expressing a concern about, we have to recuse ourselves from voting. We can provide information, but we have to take ourselves out of the decision-making process. And again, in poly communities, a lot of overlap. Somebody knows somebody used to date somebody else, right? So having to address that, I think it was really helpful to have a unique process. And broad statements, not this is everything, but any behavior, and that might be in our spaces, in our events, or in private, that compromises the safety and comfort or creating a welcoming community. So again, we hold the same standard we would hold to somebody who might be a candidate to be a board member. for those pieces. So lots of examples that are pretty common. The things that come up most commonly, I think there has been, again, folks deciding they come into a space, and even though there is often a no flirt policy for educational events, they will flirt. Also, we have a very strict policy about not sharing information or identities of anyone who comes into the space. Misgendering, those kind of pieces. So, and we have a very explicit statement about when we're talking about who we're harming and who we're concerned about. This is about folks who are most marginalized in society. So kind of a fairly broad list of isms and folks that are likely to be harmed in society that we reiterate in our meetings. We're concerned about the folks who ethical non-monogamy is most likely to be a hostile environment because the world is. So you can't report if you're a white person and they call you racist. That's not an ethical board report. You don't get to report and complaint if someone says, hey, you did something and that was harmful to me. You can't complain if somebody communicates some boundaries, right? Or tone policing as well. So those kind of pieces we give for folks and give example and usually gentle feedback, because things like this will happen. Somebody will use language or make an assumption and we'll go, hey, I don't know if you know, but this is, likely harmful behavior. Anytime there's a credible or reasonable concern, we will address that. We also have a process to kind of keep documented. So we use Slack for all of our organizational communication. And so all staff and all board members, we have one document that is folks that have concerns raised about them and the nature of the concern. So we don't lose institutional memory when someone's been problematic, or just we have this one concern and they're like, I don't want anything official, but watch this person. And a real explicit policy about we're not perfect. We've created these policies and processes, but we miss things. We engage in a process to try to make this more equitable and to revise. We've had just two revisions since I've been on the board. So it's a lot of process stuff that comes up. And then a lot of the other pieces, what I love is as a psychologist and a therapist, I'm like, oh, I feel like we're doing lots of process of conflict. And it feels like a real parallel structure to what I would want in an organization, even though the folks who originally developed this were not folks with formal mental health training. We had a lawyer who was one of the folks who developed this, and folks I think who do more conflict management work. We make it very clear for folks when they make a complaint to us what their rights are, what our process is. At any point, if they say, I don't want to engage in this anymore, we'll take the information we have. But the focus is always on understanding the concern and the harm versus let's disprove this, let's discredit folks so we don't have to do anything. I think that is not something I see in a lot of other organizations where they say, right, our focus is what can we do to enhance the safety and the welcomeness for the folks least welcome versus let's sweep this under the rug, right? People can report things anonymously or confidentially. That's tricky sometimes when you're making a complaint, you get tiny bits of information and the person having the concern raised about honestly goes, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know what the incident is. I can't respond. So they have lots of options to do that, lots of ways of reporting to us in person or through, again, our organization, some of the social media we use. We try to get as much information as possible. And then the full board processes the complaint, gathers information, tries to understand what's going on, how it might be relevant to safety and welcomeness. And again, if we have a very close relationship with somebody involved, we are asked to recuse ourselves from any official voting or influence. We can say, hey, I was present. This is the information I have. Do with it, what you think is best. And of course, if there was a complaint made about a board member, right, they would not be involved in that internal process of kind of working towards consensus to decide what to do. And really focusing on what harm was done, the impact it has for folks affected, and the overall community is the big focus. And our policy about how we follow up, taking the least intrusive action that's consistent with our values. A lot of time that is, we're going to watch this person. They're like, I'm concerned, something feels weird. We will include the person making the concern. If they have a preference for how to handle this, we will take that heavily weighted. If it's banning somebody from a meeting, removing somebody from our social media groups, also having that information and sharing it with allied communities about the concern. But it's a case-by-case basis. There may be situations where we say, hey, there's a present situation, the person just wants some space from that person. They think it is likely to calm down. They're looking for a temporary time away from that person to attend meetings. We will have some, hey, for 6 months, for a year, right? You're invited to these meetings. We ask you not to come to these events, right? To try to create safety when there's not an overarching community safety issue, but there's more of a concern. But often that is removing folks temporarily or permanently. Most often when there's minor concerns, it's communicating to the person that they have done something in violation with our values, that is not okay, not welcome, and seeing what the person making the concern wants us to do. Is it to help facilitate and that acknowledgement of harm, an apology? Is it they have specific requests of that person? Is it just, I want you to not interact with me? So that comes up a lot. And there's some folks who engage in that process and they go, wow, there's a lot of info. There's a lot of talking. There's a lot of meetings. Maybe I don't want to pursue this. Maybe I don't want to get into the details of what happened, but I want you to have this person on my radar. And so we will kind of say, hey, just keep an eye out. If anyone hears or sees something in our virtual or in-person groups that is a safety concern. This is more about the complaints too. So I think we'll also have an opportunity to talk about inclusiveness and some of the challenges we faced with making accessible spaces broadly defined as well. But yeah, things that have happened that have been kind of a challenge, and then I can kind of pass it off for discussion. Of course, as you imagine, in Ohio and in our organization, which is more polyamorous focus, the membership, the folks who attend meetings and the board have been predominantly white folks. So we really made an effort to solicit input, feedback, make space and make invitations to diversify our board. It's a very small board right now, but having folks of color, folks with experiences of disabilities, folks across kind of economic strata was really important. We used to have, I'm going to talk about the dues piece. We used to have a policy in place to join the board that you had to either make a financial contribution or fundraise for that amount of money to basically, for the filing, for the upkeep, basically to ensure that money was covered to keep the organization going. And we decided as a board that was really inequitable to have folks that were middle class or poor and basically say, you need to find or raise money to be on this board. It was not consistent with our values. So that's something we changed and removed. Accessibility of our spaces is still something that I think we're working on and not 100% where I would like to. Columbus is a pretty large size city, so finding affordable space, we subsist pretty much entirely on donations. A space that is physically accessible to folks who might be wheelchair users, spaces that are on the bus line, spaces that have good acoustics. We can get maybe 2 out of the 3, and we really had a difficult time getting all 3. We don't have our budget to offer live sign language interpretation, right? When we've done things virtually, we've been able to use some free services to increase access. But we are aware there's a lot of other ways that things might not be accessible. Those are kind of public meetings. So people's safety and comfort are an issue. And some of those have been addressed through virtual opportunities. But those meetings have also been smaller. And then working through conflicts of interest, right? How do we navigate? I think I have information relevant to a concern, but in these communities, it's a pretty small community, everyone, there's likely to have minor versus major conflicts of interest. So we have different policies for those. And a lot of what we hear is things happen outside of our meetings and our spaces, private interactions at other events than our events. When we realize there's someone we have had involved in our events, and afterwards we find out that person has had complaints or concerns raised against them in other organizations. And really, wow, I wish we had vetted that person more strongly. Is this a person we want kind of validated by being paid by us to speak? That's a big issue that we found as well. And complicated situations where folks are having complaints and concerns, and you have both the person the concern is being made about and the person making the other concern have a lot of overlapping intersectional oppressions. So usually we'd think about someone in a more dominant position. Could they be misusing this process, right? Could they not realize the harm they're doing? When we have really complicated intersections where it's really actually hard to find out what happened, folks can't provide similar data, and there's a possibility that there is multiple folks being harmful to each other, right? Even unintentionally. But certainly I think we've done a really good job, and folks have been really open on the board to saying, who's most likely to be harmed by our actions? Who do we protect? And thinking about the larger community. The most interesting recent case of this is, everything is online now and through our social media, having to make a decision about folks who want to join our group, which is a private group. We have questions they have to ask. They have to agree by the policies. And we have folks who information in their profile suggests they don't hold our values. They hold harmful beliefs. They are perpetuating misinformation scientifically, or things that are explicitly racist, sexist, homophobic, and really empowering our board to say, hey, these kinds of things, these folks are already in violation of our values. Do we want to let them in and have them have an opportunity to do harm? Or do we want to make a higher standard, right? And they can find other communities. That's the benefit of being a nonprofit is we're holding with our values and organization. And if people can't follow those rules, we have the right to say, hey, maybe this is not the space for you. That's the big overlap. I think I talked a little bit about access. But that's kind of some of the pieces that we've put in place, which I think are really important. And I've been really impressed with. So I'm eager to hear folks' thoughts, questions, and similar processes that might be happening in other spaces to try to maximize this environment.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I know that we've got people on the call because I recognize them in the participants, the attendees, who run sort of similar parts of similar organizations in countries around the world. So this should be a really interesting discussion. I think I'm just going to ask people to put Q&As in the Q&A that we'll come back to. But maybe we could move on to Christian now, and then we can have a discussion at the end of both of you, prompted by those questions. So thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I know it will have resonated with our audience. I'm going to pass over to Christian, our own dear Christian Klesse, who is a reader in sociology at Manchester Metropolitan University and co-organizer of this conference this year. He's written extensively on gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity related topics. And he's an activist and an academic, and I'm not entirely sure what he's going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to pass over and let you do your thing.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Chris. I just share my slide and let me know whether it comes up, whether you'll be able to see it.
Yep, can see it. Do you want to make it big?
Yeah. Let me just, okay. Basically it was not planned for me to present today, but we thought, like, in order to make this panel more dialogical and we bring in another paper, and I was happy to volunteer to present a paper which I have only written very recently for the World Association of Sexual Health. And I contributed it to a panel Daniel had organized on sexual justice. I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about this, to present this paper in here, because it also has an angle that explores the politics of care, which is central to our panel today. So my paper is titled "Consensual Non-Monogamy, Social Justice and the Politics of Care: Thinking Through Manifestos." Basically, what I want to do in this paper is I would like to explore the question how consensual non-monogamy and social justice are related, and how we make it possible to make these two different domains speak towards each others. Drawing on the thought of Gurpreet Mahajan, I think that if we want to think and talk about justice, we always have to talk about injustice as well, and vice versa, which inevitably leads us into the terrain of trauma, violence, exclusion, and exploitation, which is also, our subject in the panel today. So I think that talking about justice also means talking about politics, always acknowledging that the political is not the only register through which we can address the theme of injustice. Drawing on debates on gender and sexuality within various social movements, I think the insight that the personal is political and that we should think about the personal in political terms is a good starting point, which means sexuality, touch, eroticism, relationality, intimacies are spaces for the creation and enactment of closeness, kinship, obligation, and care, or they are, let's say, spaces where these values lack and are denigrated, because our minds, bodies, subjectivities relate always along and across the fault lines of racism, classism, cisgenderism, ableism, and sexism. And though, the question is there anything in consensual non-monogamy that allows its practitioners to address and advance resolutions regarding these questions of social justice? And if you look at the writing of activists and if you look at the writing of theorists, there are a lot of, let's say, people who converge on the point of view that there's a potential in consensual non-monogamy to undo, to challenge sort of some of the oppressive features of dominant modes of intimacy and sexuality. So, for example, if you look at the writing of Meg John Barker, Nathan Rambukkana, Angela Willi, Maria Palotta Chiarolli, and many others. At the same time, I think we see within polyamory politics and communities also fairly purely substituted claims that, consensual non-monogamy allegedly would carry in itself an evolutionist potential and an enhanced potential for gender equality and a promise for spiritual enlightenment and so on. So in this point, I would align myself with Barucha Pelle, who wrote in a anarchist queer feminist blog that relationships are not objects that are, depending on the formation, determines whether or not the relationship is feminist. Relationships are a social relation, one that necessarily falls within the paradigm of all other capitalist social relations, no matter what form it takes. which means that if we want to make that connection between consensual non-monogamy and wider questions of social justice, I think consensual non-monogamy needs to be reflexively politicized. And sort of we need to question and interrogate and design and stylize our relationships with a conscious reflection of wider social structures of power, such as capitalism, racism, cisgender normativity, gender subordination, body normativity, and ableism, heterosexism, compulsory monogamy, and ecological destruction. And in this paper, I decided to revisit a few political manifestos in order to see what kind of these manifestos may convey to us to rethink or to advance our critical thinking about the interrelationship of CNM and social justice. So why political manifestos? You know, if there are very different political manifestos, very often manifestos are concerned with art, literature, and politics. Very often manifestos communicate collective statements. They speak to existing social movements, or they sort of try to provide a stimulus for creating social movements. According to an online Dictionary Britannica, a manifesto advances a set of ideas, opinions, or views, but it can also lay out a plan of action. Further down, manifestos often marks the adoption of a new vision, approach, program, and genre. They criticize present state of affairs, but also announce its passing, and so on. So manifestos have a kind of a strong critical potential and tend to include a call to action as well. According to Alex Stanchev, the Communist Manifesto, could be considered to be the ur-manifesto of the modern period, in the sense that it provided a backdrop or a blueprint or template which many subsequent manifesto writers have tapped into. I suggest that the historical archive of political manifestos provides a rich repertoire of radical thought, a repertoire which, of course, needs to be scrutinized, reconsidered in the light of the material ideological outcomes of the historical movements and struggles involved. And I would like to briefly, touch upon 4 manifestos in my presentation today. So why have I chosen these 4 manifestos? I mean, the most significant aspect, I guess, is that they matter to me personally. They have enriched my thought on consensual non-monogamy and activisms. Some of these manifestos may address consensual non-monogamy, others do not. And I do not claim to suggest that my choice is here, would represent a kind of normative canon of CNM-related thoughts and politics. And I do not wish to appropriate, thought from within other social movement contexts either for, a kind of non-linear, monocausal CNM agenda. However, I suggest that it is that engaging with different social movements stimulates a dialogue in CNM politics, and creating this engagement across different terrains of struggle, if you want to put it this way, can only be fruitful for CNM activism. So in this subsequent part of my paper, I would like to talk about 4 manifestos. Firstly, the Gay Liberation Manifesto, published in the UK in 1971. the Black feminist statement of the Combahee River Collective, or the Combahee River Collective statement, the Contrasexual Manifesto, and published in France by Paul Preciado, and the Care Manifesto, published last year in the United Kingdom by the Care Manifesto. Together, these different manifestos traverse a terrain ranging from LGBTQI+, queer feminist and trans feminist, Black feminist, decolonial and anti-racist, socialist and anti-capitalist politics. The first manifesto of my choice. So why would I want to speak about the Gay Liberation Front manifesto? I think, first of all, in order to highlight that LGBTQI+ communities have been pioneers in building and developing consensual, non-monogamous ways of life and relationalities. I also would like to emphasize that a critique of the gender order, or of cis normativity and transphobia and sexism, is an important element and principle of justice-oriented CNM politics. And a more personal reason, research into Gay Liberation Front politics in the UK also shaped my own trajectory as a researcher researching consensual non-monogamy and communal forms of politics. A few words on the context. The Gay Liberation Front was founded in 1970s by a group of gay and lesbian students. It triggered an intense period of militant lesbian, gay, bisexual mobilization. It had a strong emphasis on left-wing politics, anti-capitalism, feminism, third world solidarity, also anti-psychiatry politics. And it strongly invested in the creation of communal practices, shared living, self-help, transnational solidarity. And it profoundly shaped the sexual culture and sexual politics in the UK. And the GLF Manifesto was an attempt to articulate some of the core principles of this emerging movement, or this emerging organization, which only existed for a relatively short period of time. I think what's notable in my rereading of this manifesto is the emphasis of feminist thought, the critique of gender, in particular in the context of the heteropatriarchal monogamous family, which resonates with feminist thought, but also with the pronounced critique of the feminine anti-psychiatry movements of the time. This emphasis on feminism should not let us forget that you also had profound conflicts about sexism in GLF, and that many lesbian feminists moved out collectively of the organization to strongly ally themselves with feminist politics. To give you a brief example of the critique of family, gender order, and sexism, so the manifesto authors say, we've all been brought up to believe that the family is the source of our happiness and comfort, but look at the family more closely. Also, almost before we can talk, certainly before we can think for ourselves, we are taught that there are certain attributes that are feminine and others that are masculine. These are false beliefs. So the family is critiqued as a kind of educational institution which socializes people into a heteropatriarchal gender order, which has a particular strong, let's say, creates particular strong challenges for queer people, gay people, lesbian people, bisexual people, but also feeds into a kind of sexism that also subordinates women. There's also a critique of coupleism or compulsive monogamy in the manifesto, which is kind of quite interesting. The manifesto author suggests that, yes, of course, gay couples may also want to live happily together. And the concept gay was at the time, referred to men and women. But we question this idea as an ideal, the finding and setting down internally with one right partner. This is a blueprint of the straight world. Monogamy is critique as a philosophy of ownership, with a particular, let's say, particular strong sexist connotations built into patriarchal structures. And later on, the collective goes on to discuss, the fruitfulness, worthwhile opportunity to create communes in order to, develop a mode of sociality which is different. So the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto pinpoints anti-heterosexism, pro-feminism, sex positivism, anti-capitalism, internationalism, and transnational solidarity, which I think are all orientations which are important to rethink and revitalize from a radical C&M political point of view. The second manifesto I wanted to talk about is the Contrasexual Manifesto, published first in French, later on in Spanish language in the early 2000s. It was only translated into English 3 years ago, published by Paul B. Preciado. It has has had a strong influence on international queer feminist and trans-political movements, and also draws on French anti-capitalist post-structuralist theory of various important theorists. Why would I want to talk about the Contrasexual Manifestos? So I think the manifesto is important because it attacks full-on the logic of the gender binary and the belief of an existence of oppositional and complementary sexes. It makes an argument for a radical denaturalization of gender desire and the body. The body is seen as modulated, constrained by normativity and convention in a strong Foucauldian line of the argument. But the manifesto also invites readers to reconfigure themselves, to reconfigure and modulate and experiment with our body's erotic and intimate practices, and through resignifications, new meanings applied to our bodies, our erotic practice, our interaction with others, but also for creating creative and new ways of play and interaction. And Paul B. Preciado uses a quite distinctive, unique language, theoretical language, and he talks of epistemologies of the dildo and the cyber clitoris. He applies a prosthetic logic that undoes all coherential attributes to certain parts of the bodies. I think the manifesto is a kind of quite powerful document and blueprint for breaking down heteronormative and mononormative contracts, and to collectively, and contains an appeal to collectively create new cultures of the body and intimacy. It is underpinned by transformative ethics that lends itself to a suitable starting point for conversations about utopian C&M politics, focusing on kinship, the body, intimacy, and touch, embracing a radical alterity, radical modes of presenting and embodying difference. The third manifesto I would like to briefly talk about is the Combahee River Collective statement, published in 1977. Why have I chosen to talk about the Combahee River Collective statement? It has been of paramount importance for debates about resistance to racism and sexism and resistance to racialized capitalism. It also provides insightful reflection, a very kind of uniquely developed theory of intersectionality as a mode of analysis and political strategy. And it has also provided a kind of very nuanced and critical reflection of coalition politics. The Combahee River Collective was a Black lesbian feminist socialist group in Boston that was very active in reproductive justice politics, anti-racist politics, third world and anti-imperialist politics, and so on. And the Combahee River Collective defined intersectionality in a sort of, more elaborated theoretical framework as the simultaneity of multiple oppressions, the intersection and coexistence of simultaneous multiple oppressions. Their view of politics acknowledges difference and location as key factors, but is also decisively coalitional. And the overall goal, however, is defined in more universal ways as a goal which would benefit all oppressed people, the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism, imperialism, as well as patriarchy. I put one or two quotes out here just to briefly illustrate some of the kind of, let's say, key features of the radical thought articulated in the statement. We believe that sexual politics under patriarchy is as pervasive in Black women's lives as the politics of race and class. And yeah, these things are difficult to separate from in the experiences of Black women's life, the authors state. Then they go on to make a sort of a critical statement about separatism and suggest that as Black feminists, they would also kind of enter critical coalitions with Black men in the struggle against racism. Personally, I think that engagement with the traditions of Black feminism is relevant for CNM activism for various reasons. It sharpens the perception and critique of racism, in particular in polyamory and CNM communities that may be shaped by a kind of, let's say, hegemonic whiteness. It kind of outlines nuanced critiques of racism. It challenges colonial assumptions which are so deeply ingrained within everyday practices of intimacy, as Patricia Holland and Gloria Wecker, for example, have pointed out. CMN politics directed towards social justice need to decisively oppose decolonial politics and need to be decisively anti-racist, as various Indigenous and Black polyamory activists point out, and as also Jen Paradise and Crystal Palmer-Farmer and Rainer Retti elaborated yesterday in a panel at our conference. The manifesto also makes quite clear that it is white people's task to interrogate their own racism in order to create inclusive community spaces and in order to create the precondition for activism and coalition in the first place. Okay, the last manifesto I briefly wanted to talk about is the CARE Manifesto, published by the CARE Collective last year in the United Kingdom. And we were privileged to have Jamie Hackham as a panelist here on our conference as well, who is a co-author of the CARE Collective. The CARE Collective sort of tries to provide a vision for what a collective politics which defines itself as caring politics. So that is a politics in which care is both extensive and capacious while traversing difference and distance. The kind of Care Collective manifesto reminds us of the importance to recognize that vulnerability towards, harm, violence, in colonial neoliberalist patriarchal capitalism is always distributed differentially. So some people suffer more of it as other. They also highlight that care practices in most social contexts have been feminized, and to the extent that they are frequently and mostly undertaken by women, or often by migrant workers, and again, frequently women migrant workers who have their work furthermore devalued through processes of racist judgment and racialization. So care is, of course, a critical issue in all C&M communities, whether people raise children or not. If guided by a conscious politics of care, consensual non-monogamies may be able to contribute to a more expanded and community practice of caring, for example, building upon and expanding LGBTQI+ and family of choice traditions, which are already widely discussed in C&M context. What I found kind of quite interesting is the Care Manifesto talks about promiscuous care as well, and Jamie Hakim talked about it in his contribution on the first day of the conference. For us, promiscuous care is an ethics that proliferates outwards to redefine caring relations from the most intimate to the most distant. So this kind of idea of promiscuous care builds upon the work of the radical HIV/AIDS activist Douglas Crimp and his kind of famous article on promiscuity in an epidemic. The Care Manifesto's work, I think, strongly resonates with other manifestos with similar contents that, for example, Gabriele Winker's Care Revolution, published in Germany, or the work of Precarious a la Deriva, published by a militant committee, feminist committee in Madrid, Spain. So why is it important to move towards a politics of care within C&M activism? Care is a key question of all societies and communities, both as a public and private matter, and C&M activism will find important inspiration for a queer, feminist, anti-racist, promiscuous practice of care directed to the creation and expansion of the common, if such, let's say, critical analysis are taken on board, developed, and probed, practically probed in community contexts. So let me sum up. Social justice-focused politics, or in the context of consensual non-monogamy, is in need of a conscious politicization and an ambition, a collective ambition to address the conditions and needs of complex and diverse communities. And as Maria Chiaroli rightly pointed out in a discussion yesterday, C&M activism needs to look for systemic answers, not just localized or individual answers to these problems. And apart from studying the history of various forms of C&M activism, of which there are many, I think this kind of more comprehensive politicization could gain rich inspiration if we are ready to learn from other social movements and minor discourses in politics as well, which is why I have turned to these diverse and different manifestos. Personally, I think that, the collectively, these four manifestos already, start to map out a comprehensive social justice agenda, an approach which is alliance-based and advances an intersectional, radical relational politics, which goes beyond concerns with identity and citizenships and points towards a more holistic and intersectional approach. And the latter is also a line of argument which Daniel Cardoso has been developing in their research project on polyamory activism in Portugal and the UK. Okay, thank you so much, for following me through this talk, and I'm looking forward to, discussing with you and to discussing with Michelle questions of care and social justice, in the remaining time.
Thank you so much, Christian. I really appreciate that. It's lovely when people are talking about something that they're sort of just writing about, just finishing, and it's very, live, and it really comes across, how dynamically you presented. And the same for Michelle, because this is obviously very close to your heart, your activities with your group, Poly Columbus. So it's lovely to see the passion coming through the screen today. I've got to ask a first kind of really basic, obvious question of both of you, which I'm sure our audience will be wanting to ask, which is, how do we find out more? So, Christian, where is your paper being published? And Michelle, can people get access to the materials that your group has put together? So, Michelle, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, so all of our organization policies and mission are online. I could probably throw that into the chat, but it's polycolumbus1word.org. We even have our bylaws, our process. I think some of the examples I give are not on there, but it's about 35 pages of process and policy. If you have an org and it sounds like it might be amenable, I hear it took them I think 2 years to draft this, and we've had minor amendments. So, but yeah, I can also, I think I can put that in the communal chat as well.
That's fab. Thank you so much. Because I know I'm aware of people in the attendee list who are members of similar groups around the world. Christian, where's this paper coming out? Because I need it.
Oh, thank you so much that you're interested in it. But actually, it is. It is written up as a paper, a small paper, a short paper. I'm not sure it would kind of, yet pass, a journal submission process or whatever. But, Daniel is, kindly recording our session right now. So, the talk, will be available later. And of course, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint slides as well. But I'm not yet sure where and when I will publish that.
Okay, great. I should just rewatch this and make notes. So I'd like to invite our audience to ask questions. I'm going to, hello.
We have a cat who has joined the meeting. Yes, Pussycat.
Well, now the lights actually come up. That was fabulous as well, actually, while Christian was talking. I saw dawn breaking for you. So one question's come in from MJ Barker in the UK. And they say, given what we've heard, I'd love to hear the speakers reflect about the model within consensual non-monogamy and elsewhere of injustice as one separate individual harming another. And that we need to figure out who's problematic and how to stop them. And they say, I'm wondering whether we might usefully explore models which locate the harm more within the relational system, within wider oppressive systems, and or people enacting their cultural and developmental trauma. I think that's a fabulous question for both of you, really. Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the examples I gave did focus on, we receive an individual complaint. What I love about the values and the process is, when I joined the organization and they very quickly asked me to take over as executive director, I said, this is the standard we should hold ourselves to. This is the standard we should hold our communities to. And so infused with that is who do we want to be as a board, as an organization? And let's name and think about those systems that we are swimming in at all times, right? So our board is right now it's 4 people. But when I joined, it was an all white board. It was mostly predominantly cis white women. And I said, let's talk about who's in the room and who's not in the room. And folks were like, oh, this is interesting. And so I drew on a lot. I actually teach our doctoral students in clinical psychology about power, privilege, and oppression, and naming what's happening in the room, what we're not talking about. So I do try to, in a non-academic way, which is always the challenge, try to say, what are we doing right now? Who are we leaving out? And call myself out as part of that too, like thinking about how we had not centered access issues around deaf, hard of hearing folks, around visual impairment pieces, the inherent classism in some of our systems. I said, right, if this is our policy, we've got to meet or exceed this. And we've got to admit when we screw it up. So how do we talk about that in systems? And how do we also talk about, when we have topics, what's happening in those relational systems within these polyamorous communities? How do we name unicorn hunting? Because we get folks who show up and say, hey, I'm here to find my special unicorn. How do we say, like, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this. So how do we name what happens? And for me, it's also, how do I practice that vulnerability in naming things that I've screwed up, overlooked, mistakes I've made? Like, how do we talk about the systems in a way that is makes sense for folks who don't have academic training, and name that we might be doing something harmful as we sit in front of each other, because we're all embedded in those systems. Yeah.
Christian, do you have any thoughts on this? The sort of the rather than focusing on the individual, focusing on the systems in which we relate.
I find this question difficult to answer, and I suppose I probably lack the kind of the thorough organizational and practical reflexivity which Michelle has presented in her paper on that, in the context of one particular organization and a series of events and so on. I find it also very difficult to address in a sort of more decontextualized level. My paper was, I think, was located on a more, let's say, more on a general level, to the extent that I would kind of, encourage a kind of a culture, community culture, and I would love to be part of that, and I love to play a part in that, in which in people who practice CNM and who engage in social networking around that issue critically engage with wider structural power issues, including racism, colonialism, class system, and so on, which inevitably leave an imprint in, let's say, also individual dynamics, because these kind of interlocking, oppressive systems, provide, can be plundered and used, and provide linguistic and harmful, I don't know, stuff to tap into and to haul it against others, So in that sense, but in a way, sort of the procedures of how to deal with individualized conflicts is complex. And if I understood the question rightly, MJ pointed towards a kind of relational approach. I think, attempts at mediation need time, a lot of time, a lot of commitment for many, but they also need, I think, the maturity and commitment and humbleness of all those who are partaking in them. So I think it's difficult, and I think local communities will have different ways of and local organizations, going about these things.
I do think, though, that when you're encouraging communities and organizations to, you stop me if I'm wrong, but Christian, I thought you were sort of saying that these sorts of organizations are in need of conscious politicization, if anything. And I think politicization is a sort of, it's thinking about the relational structures in which we work, both as individuals and as organizations. So maybe I can sort of ask you to think about the relationship between your two talks, because Michelle, I've got a question about Poly-Columbus bylaws, policies, and missions. Do you think that's a manifesto? Do you think?
I had never thought about it, and I'm certainly familiar. I'm generally familiar with a couple of the manifesto that Christians talked about. It's interesting. We actually have folks in my clinical training make their own personal manifesto as their last thing before they leave for internship as future psychologists. I don't know if it fits the exact definition, but it is inherently grounded in talking about those values and also contextualizing it within systems of oppression. I think it could be better and more explicit, but I think it's in the wheelhouse, right? As we talk about it, I think there's a lot of alignment there, but I'm certainly not the expert on does it meet all of these criteria. But it's one thing that really drew me when I was in the organization. I said, you know what, to have this role, I feel passionately, and I feel like the folks have done provided the groundwork for who are we and what are we about, and then how do we put that in practice continually. So I think it's in that spirit.
I mean, to me, it sounds like a manifesto. I mean, Christian, you've been thinking about this.
Yeah, and we didn't share these talks. We didn't know each other's topics. So I was in this together, and I'm like, oh, these kind of segue very well into each other.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, Christian? Do you think it sounds like a manifesto to me? You're muted.
I'm muted. I will have to read it carefully. Yeah, it has manifesto elements with it. But on the other hand, I think it is also, very sort of, meticulously thought through, procedural approach. That's what I heard. Yeah.
I think it sounds like, it's a pretty radical political organization you've got there anyway, Michelle, as far as I'm concerned. I'm wondering if our attendees who, and I know many of them are in similar type organizations around the world, if they've wrestled with the same kind of things as you, and maybe they'd like to ask you questions in the Q&A. We have got a couple of questions that have come in. Shay asks, how do you think the communal nature of CNM systems could be used to create forms of communication that allow for open dialogue with less fear of consequences for talking about harm, which is often a silencing factor, even if it's not realized? So I think they're talking about when people talk about harm and they're feeling that maybe they can't talk about that, and how can communal CNM systems help sort of remove those barriers?
I think about a little bit, I'm thinking about our monthly meetings. Well, sometimes that will come up, and we usually have a topic, but then spaces for people to kind of share or ask questions. To me, I think about kind of normalizing. So my brain goes to this is kind of a support group, and I'm aware of group therapy principles, and some of them show up in the room, although it's not therapy. So I think about being able to name that, quote unquote, the polyamory community, as if that's one thing, that damage and harm does happen, that people have been hurt by their experiences. So to name that and acknowledge that, and the policies we have about what stays here, and then helping to connect people with resources. I think that's part about, we don't have to pretend like we're perfect and we've got it all together, and that this community is actually a safe space 100% of the time. So I think that's part of it. And people have been pretty open in sharing when they've kind of been burned, when harm has happened to them, and some pretty personal, sometimes will acknowledge experiences such as trauma and pieces like that. And I think that creates a space where it doesn't feel like there's the poly people who've got everything figured out. right? That kind of like polynormativity. We got it all figured out. There's one way to do it. So I think that creates a little bit more of that space.
That's great. I think that's fab. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
Is folks who are in that position as staff or leaders. I think we try to be mindful too of people look up to us, which is we kind of go, oh, don't pretend like we got everything figured out. We've stopped making the same mistakes, but try to normalize that there's not this this hierarchy of we're staff, we've been doing this a while, we're board members, so we got all of our crap figured out. I think that's important too. We've done harm, hopefully unintentionally, but we've done harm too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether, have a kind of whether my answer really, addresses the question, whether I fully understands the question. But what I wanted to, to say is that, yes, communal structures may, make it possible and may have an element to welcome people, express, a feeling of, pain, being harmed, other things. But at the same time, I also think that communal practice, and this kind of communal dimension also carries its own risks in itself. So, I'm not involved in running, a kind of self-help group. Yeah. But I think, the principle which Michelle has referred to right now, that, what has happened here stays here. What is said here stays here is very, very important. I'm also aware of historical examples of communal projects and communal forms of therapy, which have horribly backfired, and where, people have years later been sort of, intimidated and bribed and attacked with things they disclosed in a trusted communal setting, in a quasi-therapeutic or therapeutic setting years before. So, the kind of communal, can provide a collective strength to address, harm. And I think, the whole kind of practice of consciousness raising, in the context of some of the movements I talked about, feminist consciousnesses, gay male kind of liberationist consciousness raising, addresses these issues collectively in a communal setting, addressing power, finding answers. But at the same time, the communal can also be the source of gossip and of building nasty networks of exclusion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you both sort of point out the pragmatics of it often differs from the idealism of communal spaces. So thank you for that. I've got a question coming from Leahy, particularly addressed at Christian, but I'm imagining that Michelle would have something to say about this as well. In their MA dissertation, they took a similar glance at the political manifesto of various social movements that criticised monogamy, like socialism, anarchism, feminism, GLF, etc. And they argued that in many cases, the call for consensual non-monogamy was actually abandoned when the movement gained significant sexual power, and took a less radical and more reformist approach. So they agree with your argument that CNM needs to be politicised, and but also feel that at the same time other social movements need to reconsider consensual non-monogamy. They say they'd be happy to hear your thoughts about how we work towards creating these two moves in activism and theory. This reminds me of, and I'm not sure which panel it was in, where we discussed exactly the same thing. Actually, it might have been the informal conversation yesterday afternoon about the abandonment of more radical principles once communities are sort of getting close to their overarching aim. So, do you have any thoughts about how these other social movements might link?
I mean, personally, I tend to think of, social movements tend to go through different periods, and they may have more radical periods, and, but at the same time, I think social movements very often, they never are completely coherent in that sense. So, you always have different currents of, different political voices within social movements, which make social movements different from political parties, for example, which are much more prone sort of to push a kind of, standard line. But, for example, I would personally think that, the normative pull, the normative pressure, is an issue each and every social movement has to deal with, to the extent that, I think, I think there's rest an enormous appeal and power in, the dream, to be ordinary, or to be, to claim full citizenship, to be accepted, whether this is possible or whether that's, an effect of, cruel optimism, as Laurent Berland would say. But I think, basically I wouldn't necessarily say, these movements need to, rethink their radical origins and so on. I think, that's an issue for all social movements. And, CNM movements themselves, even if, they may be very clear about, multi-partner relationality, are themselves, at risk being drawn in that kind of normativity.
Yeah, we've definitely heard that mentioned over the last few days. Michelle, any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think just one specific, what I see and what I think is important to name too is this idea that folks engage in CNM, like if we're talking about that call for this is a radical way of relating, it's easy to say that as a platitude and certainly be aware of its potential, but then what happens in practice. So, and I noticed too how the language folks use. So. What we notice and what I think is really great we see in the organization is we have tons of folks who want like a polyfidelitous, closed triad. And we like, yeah, you can have a want, but what if something else happens? And are you putting that on other folks? And we have a pretty notable and pretty consistent like solo poly group that says, hey, guess what? Just because I might want multiple partners, multiple intimate partners in what way, I don't consider the relationship part of that isn't the most important part of it. So I love the within group variation and difference. It's not, I think that's what I wonder is happening with the, hey, this is this radical way of relating. And that can look 17 different ways. So it becomes what is the one true way? That's the most radical way. And then you find that folks go, guess what? That's not actually true or authentic for me. I love the spirit, the idea behind this. But then someone goes, well, my way is the way that's going to fit that radical definition. And I think there's that real danger there because that's another way of kind of using power and saying, guess what? My way is the best way. This is how we're going to do it all. And I love that we have spaces, and I get corrected on that all the time because I was like, I get part of that spirit of solo poly movements, and emotionally I really connect to that, even though my relationships don't. They sort of look like that, but not right. So trying to constantly be thinking about everyone's not doing this in the same way. What's the spirit that's about true, authentic consent and self-chosen intimacy? And it's not necessarily about you need to have 3 partners or you're not really doing this in this way. Yeah. So I think that kind of goes back to the polynormativity and the like one image of this is what it looks like. And that's the real one true poly.
Yeah.
I really like that, what you're saying. I fully subscribe to Michelle's view on that.
Lovely. We've got a question come in which has come up before again in the discussion yesterday. Naomi and Diana say, I keep missing a space for religious minorities within the poly communities. There's often a crossover, but very little dialogue. Do you think that CNM... Oh, I've lost it. Beg your pardon. Do you think that CNM community worries about perceived abuse within these minorities and would rather ignore the issue. So I'm imagining that they're thinking, but please correct me if I'm wrong, Naomi and Diana, about things like polygamy within Islamic communities, and do our CNM communities worry about perceived abuse within those religious minorities or others? And do you think they would rather ignore the issue? Do you have any experience or thoughts about that, Michelle, in your own community?
Oh, I've heard, that distancing, we're not this, because they do associate, if what we're talking about specifically is the, proscribed multiple partner, but based on a model of a man with multiple partners, multiple wives, where that is not equitable. I think there is that distancing. There's been at least a couple instances where we've had folks who have come from religious backgrounds where there was that system that was not truly consent-based. And they talk about the complexity of, I want multiple intimate relationships, and I was raised in this one version that did not uphold the kind of consent I want to engage in, right? So they'll talk about, in contrast, it doesn't come up a lot. We certainly talk about people's faith experiences, positive and negative, pretty broadly, but within Ohio, that tends to be very Judeo-Christian based as their experiences. But there has been, I've heard a little bit of folks talking about, I was raised with this, and it has some overlap with polyamory, but it's not the same thing. But usually that's one voice in the room.
Well, Naomi, Diana have done a follow-up saying, even just religious people at all who happen to be poly, not for particularly religious reasons, but it sounds like that you do make space for that. You have had people talking about how their religious upbringing informs their experiences nowadays. Christian, have you found any sort of political manifesto that has talked about religious influences on these sorts of areas? Because what you're talking about before, I didn't sense any sort of impact from religion on those ideas. Not explicitly, anyway.
I don't know, basically, there are sort of websites about I think liberated Christians, and and you also would have in other kind of religious settings, people who are sort of more open about aspects also from, let's say, Muslim versions of polygamy. I knew there were individual, let's say, campaigners around polygamy in Switzerland and so on. With a kind of, let's say, CNM and polyamory context, when I started doing research on that, I would say there's a kind of, there's a very strong streak of, let's say, emphasis on the spiritual, certainly, and it's very difficult to separate, the religious from the spiritual, but, let's say a sort of, new age types of, spirituality, references to Wiccanism. You've got, all kinds of religious/spiritual emphases within different poly communities, I guess. So personally, I would say there is potential space, but local communities may differ, yeah.
So thank you both very much. If the audience has any last questions, please do send them through now. I'm just going to bring this to a close, though. We're getting towards 1 o'clock, which is when we're hoping to end the panel. It's been really lovely. Christian, Michelle, and Michelle's cat, most importantly, has made a valuable contribution to this. And I found myself smiling enough and at you stroking it at various points, and then thinking,
This is her international debut. So Pussycat's very excited. And she's normally very grumpy. So I think y'all created a space where she feels comfortable in purring and being adorable.
We're delighted. We're delighted to have her. Thank you both so much for this panel. It's been so interesting. This just fascinating stuff. I really like the fact that we've got the political, the personal, and the academic all coming together to really think about change and impact. It's very exciting. So thank you both very, very much indeed. We're going to wind up. I'm going to remind the audience that we have one last session in the conference this afternoon, beginning at 2:30, on Global South and Latinx experiences. And it'll be a presentation from NMCI 2022, the committee who will be organising that conference in Chile next year, which should be really exciting. So please do come along at 2:30 to hear about their presentation, and also they'll be talking about what they're planning for next year, I think. So it just leaves me to thank Christian and Michelle one last time. Thank you very much, and see you at 2:30, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, folks.
Bye bye. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Chris. Ciao.